Hey, what's going on, guys? It's Paul from Prior Witness. Long time no see. Hopefully, you're having a fantastic day. We're going to get back into this stuff. First, we're going to talk about the Ampero II Stomp and get something out of the way with the bass guitar. We're going to be going into a few different kinds of tones. Mainly, we're looking at hard rock and metal tones here. So, if you're looking for something clean, something funky, sorry. But if you want me to cover that, I can do that too. But this is what we're going to start with. First, we're going to look at the MPEG. We're going to take a look at that, going through its paces, through some actual York audio IRs that I own, as well as the internal cab. Then, as a little bit of a bonus, we're going to also look at the Mesa 400 as well, look at the internal cab there. And then, just to compare and contrast, we're also going to be looking at my real bass amp, running in through a York audio IR as well, just to compare and contrast, just to give you an idea of what the Ampero II Stomp bass tone sounds like compared to a real actual bass tone. And then on top of that, we'll be going into the nitty gritty and all the nerdy stuff after hearing some sounds. So let's get to it. Okay, now that you've heard the riff a million times over, you're probably sick and tired of it. I am too. So let's get going. Let's start off with the bass that we had on the Ampero II Stomp, then I'll get to the actual bass amp that I own. So here's what's going on in here for all the nerdy, nitty-gritty stuff. I'm using IRs from York. These are the MPEG 4x10 York IRs, and this one, and they're all on torpedo wall of sound, and I'll walk you through that here in a second. We're using the 120-2 or 160-2, and then the 57 CE. That's a ribbon mic essentially, and then that's SM57 on the center end cap there. And all I'm doing here is adding a little of that exciter stuff that's going on in two notes. It just, gives it a little bit more oomph and a little bit more sparkle, high end, that kind of thing. And then using the built-in reverb too on Studio B. And it's the same across the board for everything that's using that Torpedo IR. So I've got that on the first bass iteration that you hear on the Ampero II Stomp. And then after that, we're using the internal Ampero II cabs. And then on the third bass, we are using the Mesa Boogie 400 bass amp. And then that's using its own internal cab IR. Didn't use Torpedo on that one. And then just for kicks, wanted to compare it within the same video, what a real bass amp would sound like into those York IRs and give you an idea of what that sounded like too, just to compare and contrast. So I'll give you a look, see what's going on in the Ampero II. Let's get this thing fired up, and I'll show you what's going on in there. So here we have the software open. Let me make sure I'm on the right preset that I was using. We are on bass MPEG 2 plus 2. Plus 2 stands for I have a foot switch, dual foot switch. Anyways, so here, how it's working, and I'll show a very brief screenshot of my pedal board that's going in. So just for full transparency, what's going on here. I've got a Fender bass. Well, it's a Squire. Okay, it's the cheapest Squire you can find on Sweetwater. It's the precision bass. And then that's going into a whammy pedal, and then the whammy pedals goes into a wah. They're not on, but you know, in case you think it's coloring the sound, there you go. And then that's going into the Ampero II, and then in the Ampero II, it hits this compressor first. It's just the squeezer. It's supposed to be like their little studio compressor, and that has a threshold of 49, ratio of 40, output of 50. You could read all that, so on and so forth. Not a whole lot there. The blend is all the way at 100. Next thing that's being used is the bass overdrive. That is being turned on. I know it's off here in the software, but it gets kicked on throughout the recording process. There's not a whole lot of gain. The blend is pretty low, and volume, bass, and treble are all mid. The effects loop is on. It's just for my standard preset. I sometimes will have other overdrives and so forth going into that, but none of that was on in this one. So the effects loop was essentially doing absolutely nothing. And then here's the bass amp itself in the Ampero II Stomp. And the thing that I really want you to pay attention to is this part right here under the treble section. Holy moly, I had to crank that sucker, and it still was pretty low. And we augment that with EQ here later on. The mid-range function, there's actually a lot of versatility here you can do with the MPEG. So I don't know if you can read this on the side here. I'm not sure how it looks on your end, but it's based on the MPEG SVT. And so, but it's got a mid-range dial in here, and it goes from 220 to 450, 800, 1.6 kilohertz, all the way up to 3 kilohertz. I chose the 1.6. To me, it sounds a little shrilly when you get to 3.2, but, you know, it is what it is. It's, you know, trust your ears, you know. Middle's at 80. Again, had to crank that a little bit. For some reason, it is super scooped once you pass that threshold of 50, and it doesn't sound like a pleasant scoop either. But that's just my opinion. I mean, at the end of the day, use your ears. We're going for that clanky hard rock, you know, grunge rock, you know, bass tone kind of thing. So take all these settings with a grain of salt there. If that's not quite your jam, but you're still listening anyways, just get an idea of what the Ampero II sounds like for bass. And then, of course, the bass is dialed back a little bit. Gain is on 50. And I know I had the drive on there the entire time, but just remember that the gain really doesn't affect things a whole lot in terms of grit and distortion. It really just plays with the volume. There's not really a whole lot that goes on there when it comes to any overdrive or anything. It doesn't react the same way as the real bass amp does, and that's a little disappointing, I think. But you know, it is what it is. Next thing in the chain is just a noise gate. See the threshold's at 45. On the EQ, a lot is going on here, okay? So on the MPEG, we really dialed down the mid-range here at 500 hertz. Not a whole lot going on 400. We dialed up a little bit on the back end on the bass just to add a little bit more thumpiness. And then on the high end is where we really started to crank things. And oh, by the way, this EQ is based on the Boss, 7B equalizer. That's what this is supposed to be emulating. You got 800 hertz here. You got 4.5 kilohertz, and then we even cranked up on the 10. And believe it or not, that does make a difference too. So that's all that's going on. For the bass tones that have the Ampero II Stomp with the cab baked in, that's what's going on here. I've got the mic type under mix. It just says it's a multi-mic combo. I don't know if that's combining all of these mics at once or they're doing something else in there, but to my ears, I just find that to work the best with the Ampeg. You actually get some pretty decent results if you just do the one that's based off the Neumann U87, but pretty good, I think. And then EQ, you got between 1 and 2. One's supposed to be, and you can kind of read this over here on this side too. I don't know if you can read that, but it says 1 is a rounder tone, 2 is a fatter tone. Look, use your ears. There's not a whole lot of difference. You can kind of tell when there's a drop off. It almost like it scoops part of the mids out and bumps the mids out and just kind of does an inverse of the two. So I don't know. Again, use your ears. There's more going on here on the Mesa. As I look over here now, some of this stuff is going to be the same. Like you'll see, the compressor over here is doing pretty much the same thing. And keep in mind, all I'm trying to do, my end goal with the compressor at the beginning is not to create this thumpiness or anything like that. It's literally just to clean up the guitar playing. I'm using a very cheap bass, so I'm having to compensate for the substandard pickups that are in the thing. I guess I shouldn't say substandard. The pickups are what they are. It's okay. It's just when you really hit hard on the pick, it tends to make them pop a little bit. And I don't know if that's a defect in the bass guitar or not, but I digress. Overdrive, same thing. 15 gain, blend of 25. Everything else is straight up across the board. Effects loop, there's not much going on in there. There's nothing going on in there. So we'll get to the bass amp. That's the important part. Now here we're doing volume of 40, master of 60. The bass is actually cranked a little bit. The mids are cranked up a little bit more, and the treble. To me, I thought I found a sweet spot there, not getting too shrilly, but not getting, too trebly either, just maintaining that nice, rock bass tone. I thought I did a good job, but, I did what I could. EQ, we did even more there. We scooped out 800 hertz this time instead of 500 like we did on the Ampeg, and then we just cranked the 4.5 to try to bring it a little bit more treble. A common theme you're going to find here, if you decide to use bass guitar on your Ampero II Stomp, all these bass amps run very high on the bass. Like, this is kind of like what you got to do to compensate for it. There's not a whole lot of treble going on. There's not a whole lot of upper frequency going on. Everything's really, really focused on that bass tone on the bass end. And I know you're probably thinking, well, yeah, it's a bass amp, right? And you'd be surprised the more you research on bass guitar tone, especially if you like stuff like an extreme example is Iron Maiden. I mean, Steve Harris's bass tone there's not a whole lot of bass going on. It's more mids and treble than anything. So if you're trying to go for a tone kind of like that, you're going to have some challenges doing that on this thing. That's for sure. Now, the only other thing that we did that I thought was just a fun thing to do. I almost didn't even do this, honestly. But I have a real bass amp, and I thought, let's just compare right in the video itself what it sounds like and see what we come up with. So, again, we're using pretty much the same kind of controls on the compressor, and we got a noise gate. The effects loop this time, what's going on with the effects loop is it's going out to my bass amp. Now, my bass amp, I'm going to put a picture up on the screen here for you so you get an idea of what the thing looks like. It's an old bass amp, and I don't really see these out there in the wild. But what it is, essentially, it is a not York Audio, but a Yorkville Sound bass amp. It was called the Block 80B. It's a really clean bass amp. There's no distortion going on in the thing. I even took a picture of the bass amp settings that I'm using. So I'll put that up on the screen too, post editing. So I'm looking at a picture on my phone right now to get this, but hopefully you're seeing it on your screen now. Got the treble, also known as treble. Treble's at about 8, and then I got the mids pretty scooped on the thing, and then the bass. I know it's hard to tell from my picture, but it's at about a 6 is where it's at, and then the whole thing's just running into the effects loop of the Ampero II Stomp. And then what I'm doing in post after the effects loop is, again, since I'm going for kind of like this dark glassish, hard rock, metal tone on the thing, I still scooped about quite a bit on 500 hertz, and I was able to get that for me. If I don't scoop out the 500 hertz, it really gives me a more boxy-like bass tone. It doesn't sound bad, and that might sound bad on the surface when I say that, but it does its thing, and it really does a really good job emulating the bass equalizer pedal that the bass Boss has, and really does a good job scooping that out. And of course, I crank up the high end on it too, just so I can get some more of that clankiness going on. The con is, though, because of the bass guitar I'm using, it tends to accentuate some of that picking. So if it was driving you nuts when I was first playing, that's why I kind of smoothed it out as I played again. I thought about doing another take, but I thought, no, I'll leave it in there to demonstrate. So hopefully that helps, so you get a better idea of what's going on. But yeah, so there you go. I mean, there's the Ampero II Stomp, and that's really what this video is all about, just kind of showing you all the kinds of things that you can do on the bass side of things when it comes to Ampero II Stomp. And as I'm rattling around and talking, this will give you an idea of your bass selection. You do have other bass amps here at your disposal. I'm not a fan of these other 3, the flip top, the Vox, and the orange. I think they all kind of sound pretty muddy, but I don't know. Maybe it's just not my genre of music. Maybe I'm just not tweaking them right. I don't know, but I'm not a fan of either of those. I find that when I do have to use bass tones in the Ampero II Stomp, I'm going in between these two, the Ampeg or the Mesa 400. More often than not, the Mesa 400. I think it sounds pretty good in here. The last thing I do want to touch on, though, is... Oh, and before I go, let me go to your cabs so you get an idea of what kind of cabs are in here. I don't really see a whole lot of people doing this, so this gives you an idea, too. You've got internal bass cabs in here. You got 210s, and they've got different kinds of flavors of 210s. They do something with the EQ on them, so if you're wondering why is there so many different kinds, that's really what's going on here. They all sound similar, but if you listen hard enough, they do tend to accentuate different frequencies, but not really a whole lot of variety there at the end of the day. I would highly recommend you use your own IRs if you can. Excuse me. Last but not least, love to hear your thoughts on how you thought it all sounded at the end of the day, if you thought it was usable. Look, if you're still listening, I appreciate it. My opinion at the end of the day is this. I think if you're a guitarist and you're being asked and called in to do a quick gig and be the bass guitarist for a band, they're in a pinch, they need you to come in, play bass for them, and this is a solid option, I think. Anyways, there you go. I hope you learned something, and I hope that this was useful for you. If you want me to do more of this, like with a clean tone, for example, maybe the distorted tone drove you nuts, and you want to hear a clean version of this? Yeah, sure, I can do that. No worries. I'm going to do some more Ampero II Stomp content here in the near future. Just got this thing a few months ago, and I'm really loving it. I think it's great. I actually bought it for effects, and it's turned into the opposite, where I really like its amp modeling better than its effects, so I've been building effects around it and really using it for its amp technology. The amp sounds in here are just fantastic. They're great. So if you want to hear more, subscribe, and let me know what you want to hear. I'll do what I can, and I'll see you on the next one. Thanks, everybody.